Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the e-CAMCA Forum 2021. And we're starting with a bang. My name is Ali Aslan. I'm an international TV presenter and journalist, and it's my great pleasure to host and moderate this upcoming session, which is with none other than the chairman and CEO of the Mobi Group, Saad Mohseni. Wonderful to have him with us. He needs very little introduction. He's a household name in the region and beyond. He's Afghanistan's first true media mogul and has built a reputation as an innovative entrepreneur. His organization, Mobi Group, Afghanistan's largest private media company, has become one of the fastest growing diversified companies in South and Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. As chairman and CEO of the group, Mohseni has been widely applauded for empowering civil society, promoting accountability from governments, and defending women's rights. And it's my great pleasure to welcome here. Hello, Saad. Wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you, Ali. Great to be here.
Saad, obviously much to talk about in these 45 minutes, which of course our viewers are more than welcome to participate by submitting questions, which I'm happy to forward to our speakers. Let's go back to 2001 for a second before we engage and talk about current events. Back in 2001, after the Taliban government was overthrown and removed from power in Afghanistan, you left Australia for Kabul to launch the Mobi Group, which, as we just heard, turned out to be a very successful and groundbreaking endeavor. Looking back, would you do it all over again?
Absolutely. I think it's probably the most fulfilling thing anyone can do, to go to, to return to one's home, which I think is something very special, but also to build something from scratch. And as an entrepreneur, and that's what you always strive to find the next big opportunity. And for us, we've had our ups and downs, no doubts about it, but I think it's been reflecting and looking back and going back to Kabul once, every few weeks and seeing for ourselves and how much the place has changed and the small contribution we've made. It's something that we would do all over again.
Yeah, indeed. You talked about some of the setbacks that you have encountered, of course, in this very pioneering endeavor. It's no secret that press freedom in Afghanistan has its limits, and we've seen an unfortunate series of attacks on journalism in your country. As a matter of fact, you lost employees in attacks in the past. Did you, throughout this time, ever think of leaving Afghanistan and move your investment somewhere else?
No, I think if anything, it's made us more determined to do what we have to do. I mean, of course, we're mindful of our staff members and how to safeguard their interests and their lives, but our people are very determined as well. I recall when there was that incident where one of our buses was blown up by the Haqqani network, by the Taliban. We put it to our staff members, if they, I put it to them, if you wish for us to shut down the operations, we're happy to do so. And they were very determined, almost too determined. You'd think that they would, there'd be some hesitancy, but I think they pretty much all felt that we have to keep going. And we're dealing with a very courageous group of young Afghans. We have almost 500 employees. I think people are scared, but nonetheless, they feel that they're doing something quite important.
Yeah, quite important indeed. In times like these, particularly, Afghanistan is going through yet another very crucial transitional period, and its consequences we will dive into just a moment. But you once said that one of the reasons Afghanistan has not exploded yet is due to the media, is that the media gives people an outlet. What did you mean by that?
Well, people ask, like, for example, there's corruption, the government is inept, there's just so many things going wrong, and in the country, in the sense that billions have been spent, one could argue trillions. and still the Afghan public has sort of we haven't seen the sorts of things that you would see in streets of other major countries. If you see the levels of corruption, for example, we saw it in North Africa, we saw it in other parts of the Middle East, mostly driven by people's contempt of corrupt officials. But in Afghanistan, I think the fact that we could report on corruption, on ineptitude, on wastage, I think it allowed people, there was an outlet. And quite often people would not call the police or would not call the prosecutor, they would call one of the media organizations, and there are dozens of them in Afghanistan. We're one of 50 or 60 TV stations. And I think it gives people satisfaction to see corrupt officials get exposed, inept security officials get exposed. And I think it helps. I mean, it's sort of, otherwise a society becomes like a pressure cooker. And I think we have helped in terms of dealing with these sorts of frustration.
And the frustration that is more than understandable on the part of the citizens that have been through so much over the past decade, 2 decades, if not more. Afghanistan certainly has seen a long period of bloodshed and pain. You're not only a successful businessman, of course, but also deeply involved in Afghan current political and social affairs. How has the country changed from the day you arrived in 2001?
I mean, I talk about this quite often, but actually I really mean it. I think I was really, I was traumatized just looking at people's faces in Kabul. I mean, when I describe the inhabitants of this capital city as zombies, I'm not exaggerating. They were sort of walking aimlessly. And I recall 21st of March in 2002, which was the first Nowruz. There was nothing for people to do, and I recall a group just walking towards the hill in Wazir Akbar Khan, which is in the middle of bang in the middle of Kabul. People had no idea what to do, what they were doing. They had been traumatized by 5 or so years of Taliban rule. So that was the Afghanistan that we went back to. And then you fast forward to 2021, you're seeing a transformed country. I mean, first and foremost, the population has grown. Our cities are massive now. The urban-rural divide is now pretty much 50-50. The younger population, the vast majority of our 35 million inhabitants are under the age of 20. Median age is 18. It's the youngest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa. Population is continuing to grow. I think it's 2 or 3%. It's we will be up to 100 million in the next 4 or 5 decades. So you're seeing a really an Afghanistan that's really changed in less than a generation, and has changed dramatically. And in terms of how they consume media, in terms of their aspirations, how they look, how they dress, and the mindset has changed. I think people are not the way they used to be now. Of course, there are 2 Afghanistans. There's a sort of the Afghanistan of our major cities, and who may be a majority, and then of course you've got the Afghanistan that resides in the rural areas, and they're just as impoverished as they were. So we have seen, like so many other countries, we've seen we're seeing a middle class emerge, but we're still seeing a lot of poverty.
A lot of poverty that we're seeing in Afghanistan, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, of course, but still you do see the improvements and the progression over the past 2 decades. That is very encouraging indeed. Now, you said you started in Afghanistan having to deal with your own trauma. How's it changed you as an entrepreneur, not as a human being, but has it made you a better entrepreneur, a different entrepreneur?
Well, I think as a businessman, you learn. I mean, of course, you learn how to manage your business, how to manage people. We have a large organization in Afghanistan. We have close to 500 employees, but worldwide at one stage we had over 1,200 people. So I think, yes, you learn. We've learned a lot. I was in my 30s when we first returned to Afghanistan, and prior to that, we had not run a media business in a place as complicated and as challenging as Afghanistan. So we have learned a lot lots of lessons for us, and we're constantly learning. We're still learning.
The learning never stops. I think that goes for everyone, but particularly for someone like you, who's operating at such a high level in such a complicated, volatile region. Now, we are, of course, at the CAMCA Forum, which, aside from Afghanistan, also deals and focuses on matters in Central Asia, Mongolia, and the Caucasus. Have you ever thought, you're a pioneer, of course, of free media in the region with the goal to expand, not just in Afghanistan, but beyond Afghanistan. Are there any other countries in the CAMCA region that has struck your eye as an entrepreneur, as a promising market?
You know, we already have viewers in Central Asia and Tajikistan. I think one of our TV stations, Tolo, as well as Tolo News, is very popular with the local Tajikis. But also in Samarkand and Bukhara, we have viewers. So we already have a market of sorts in Central Asia. But we are very interested in the sort of former Soviet Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, even Turkmenistan. I think there are enormous opportunities business-wise between that region and South Asia, which is Pakistan and India. And Afghanistan essentially is the corridor connecting these two regions. So of late, we've studied what else we can do as a group, as a business organization, and we have had some serious discussions with our friends in particular in Uzbekistan. Right now, electricity is exported to both Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a massive pipeline, gas pipeline, that should be, work has started. I think they've concluded the Turkmen side of the pipelines, and I think work will start to connect Turkmenistan to Pakistan in the next, I think, 6 to 12 months. There are massive railway projects connecting Uzbekistan to Pakistan. There are 2 actually on the table. And then, of course, roads and so forth that would allow for better, more efficient ways to deliver, to move products from one region to the other. But even with tourism, I mean, when I was in Uzbekistan, what I was told, and I saw it for myself, is how many tourists were there in Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara from Afghanistan. So, and I think that in particular, the Uzbek government sees the benefits of this sort of regional connectivity and economic integration. So I think there are enormous opportunities for people of these, 3, I would call Afghanistan as a separate country, but South Asia in terms of Pakistan and India, and of course, the 5 stans in Central Asia, as well as Afghanistan.
And regional cooperation is, of course, what the CAMCA Forum is all about. You are one of the most prominent businessmen coming out from Afghanistan, not just in the country, but beyond Afghanistan's borders. Of course, Time Magazine has named you as one of the most influential people in the world. I'm sure a lot of people come up to you in Afghanistan, particularly young people, asking for advice. What advice do you give young people in Afghanistan moving forward, young entrepreneurs in Afghanistan moving forward?
I think just to do it. It's often that there's people overanalyze opportunities. They would like to do things, but they're afraid to sort of take the plunge. I think just having the ability to start something is really important for an entrepreneur. You can't overthink an idea. It's good to do your feasibility studies and so forth, but it's important to just start the business or whatever opportunity you've been presented with. It's very important. But I think working hard, I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that working hard and being diligent. I mean, if you're there after 2 to 3 years and you're still there, there's a good chance you'll not only survive, but you'll prosper. Putting a good team together, I think, is very important. Identifying like-minded individuals, paying them, providing them with incentives, creating a good team environment. All of these things are important. It's important. I mean, it's also important to acknowledge that what works well in other countries can also work in Afghanistan, and vice versa.
Of course, it's all a mutual learning process, I think, for everyone involved. Let's look at current Afghan politics for a second. It has been dominating the headlines for some time. It will most likely dominate the headlines, particularly leading up to the announced US withdrawal on September 11th, a very symbolic date, of course, 20 years after 9/11. Now, violence since Washington has pledged to withdraw all US troops from Afghanistan, which was part of the US Taliban deal, of course, violence has actually increased in Afghanistan, not decreased. Are you concerned about what could happen, what might happen after US and NATO troops leave?
Yes, and we've seen the last few days that a whole bunch of districts have been overrun by Taliban forces. I suspect the Americans will be out way before September, probably in the next few weeks, and violence will increase, and it has. And we lose up to anywhere from 200 to 400 Afghans in a 24-hour period. Taliban, Afghan soldiers, civilians, and no nation can tolerate this much pain and this much suffering and this much loss. So obviously we're greatly concerned, and as sort of security deteriorates, we're concerned also for our employees and of course our compatriots, which we always talk about, and we always provide lots of coverage of casualties and fatalities. But we're at a crucial juncture, and we've been big supporters of this peace process, pushing all sides to sit and talk peace. And it's important for not just the Afghans, but also for the region to recognize how a violent, Afghanistan getting torn, to different bits because of this potential civil war could impact not just Afghanistan, but the entire region. So I think it's in all our benefits to deal with what we're seeing, the beginning of something very, I think, potentially disastrous. All of us collectively should be very concerned over what's going on in the country.
The concern, I think, is more than justified. And to say that we are at a critical juncture in Afghanistan, as you put, is probably an understatement. All eyes are on what is going to happen after US and NATO troops withdraw, after 20-year stay, after 2 decades of US and NATO presence, of course, in the country. And the question everybody is asking, can Afghanistan retain the benefits it has achieved in the previous 2 decades? Can it remain a progressive modern republic with the Taliban being part in government? What do you think?
I think if we end up with a government that's totally dominated by the Taliban, the answer to that would be no. At least in the immediate future, they will roll back many of the gains, including freedom of expression, as well as women's rights and so forth. So it's very important that, sitting down and talking peace and creating some sort of a mechanism or a process where there is a power sharing arrangement, I think would ensure that some of these gains are protected. But my concern is that we will go back to the 1990s, although the population has changed dramatically.
And as you pointed out, many of the gains that Afghanistan have made in the past 2 decades are at risk. You are known and have been applauded for empowering civil society, promoting accountability from governments, and particularly for defending women's rights. You've already mentioned the progress that has been made in the country. Now, the US withdrawal, of course, worries women's rights activists, saying the Taliban return to power would compromise the progress that has been made. You think that those concerns are justified, yes? Absolutely.
We obviously report on districts which have fallen to the Taliban, and we can see for ourselves that not much has changed in terms of how the Taliban behave towards minorities, towards women, towards anything that represents a sort of a modern Afghanistan. We've seen footage of buildings, government buildings getting blown up by the Taliban. So these are ominous signs, unfortunately.
So it doesn't seem that the Taliban has changed. It doesn't seem that the Taliban has reformed itself in the past 20 years since it was removed from power. I had an interview recently with former President Hamid Karzai, and we talked about the US and NATO involvement in Afghanistan, and I asked him how he would assess it, mostly positive or negative. While he acknowledged the positive effects, he also blamed the Americans for how shall he put it, a very heavy-handed approach towards civilians in particular. Do you share that assessment?
Yeah, I think he's partially right. I think that, yes, you can't just blow up people and expect them to change. Mistakes were made, but also I think that we also have to acknowledge that we made, collectively as Afghans, we made a lot of mistakes. I think corruption and bad governance led to, there was a vacuum, and the Taliban filled that vacuum in many parts of the country. Our justice system was corrupt, inept. The behavior of the police and bureaucrats, very, very much a predatory behavior, also pushed a lot of people towards, sort of accepting the Taliban as sort of as an alternative to the central government. So as much as we can blame the Americans, and of course they and the international forces who were sort of their heavy-handed approach in different parts of the country, we should also blame ourselves.
The blame lies on both parts, a very self-critical, realistic assessment on the part of Saad Mohseni. This is just a reminder for the audience members to submit questions. I see we've already received one anonymous viewer is saying, with recent incidents at the Afghanistan border with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and possibly inevitable escalation of armed conflicts on these borders where main transit points are located, do you see change in all form of engagement, including transit and trade, is the question?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, if the violence continues, I think that first and foremost, the Central Asians, will get freaked out because of, potentially some of these armed groups crossing the border, or it could be drugs, or it could be refugees. I recall in the 90s, the friendship bridge that connects Afghanistan and Uzbekistan was completely shut down. President Karimov was petrified of the possibility of Islamists crossing the bridge and infiltrating Uzbekistan. So those concerns are valid, and I think that's going to impact trade as well. I mean, if you see these transit points get shut down, it's going to impact trade, not just impact Afghanistan, but also Central Asia and vice versa.
We are almost 25 minutes into the conversation. A reminder to our viewers, we have approximately 20 minutes left. So if you have questions for Saad Mohseni, please don't hesitate to submit them. I will include them in this discussion and the remaining 20 minutes as the conversation progresses. Saad, with the current situation in Afghanistan and the upcoming withdrawal on the part of US and NATO troops, where do you see your group of media outlets in a year from now?
Hopefully still in Afghanistan, and in a position to actually do the things that we've been doing over the last few years, which is the last 20 years, but to report on facts, to provide people with entertainment and information. And to engage audiences right across the country.
Have you reached out to the Taliban, or has the Taliban reached out to you as far as the future steps are concerned about a collaboration, perhaps getting to know each other, process, any of that sort?
Well, we obviously speak to them on a day-to-day basis when it comes to reporting on what's going on around the country, especially with the fighting. That we've seen the escalation of violence across the country. There's now sort of a serious war of narratives between the Taliban and government forces in terms of who's where and who has prevailed where, and we're in touch with all sides. But yeah, my colleague Lutfullah Najafizadeh, who's on this webinar, he met with the Taliban in Doha, with the senior leadership of the Taliban, and so we've tried to engage at all levels.
What are they telling you?
Well, my assumption is that what they're telling us now may not be true if they were to take over the country. They obviously need the media. They need their narrative, their particular narrative, in particular in terms of what's going on now. They want coverage of what they're doing. They want an amplification of their messaging or narratives. So I think that they would be inclined to be more conciliatory, but I'm not sure if I would believe everything they're telling us today, based on their past history.
Yeah, caution certainly is in order, considering the past. You've already pointed out that you think the Americans will leave actually way before the September 11 deadline, and Talan Sultanov's question is pointing towards that. He says, what do you think would be the outcome of the upcoming meeting between Afghan President Ashraf Ghani with US President Biden? Do you think the US might change its mind about complete withdrawal, given the latest developments, given the violence that we've seen?
Well, I mean, we just go by what we read in the U.S. media, and my assumption is, that this is, there was an article in this morning's Wall Street Journal that the Americans will stick to their timelines, will complete their drawdown in the weeks ahead. So I don't see that as likely. I think it's more of I wouldn't call it a PR stunt, but it's important for the Americans to give the impression that they're not just pushing the Afghans under the bus, which they may very well be doing. But nonetheless, I think they want to give the impression that they're engaged, that security assistance, as well, assistance to the Afghan National Security Defense Forces, assistance to the government, development projects will continue. And of course, from the Afghan side, they would want, there are some teething problems in terms of this transition from US to Afghan forces, maintenance of equipment, training of our soldiers, and so forth, procurement of hardware. And I think this will give the Afghans the opportunity to sort of say, okay, these are some of the issues that we need to resolve. What do you suggest we do? So for the Americans, it's more or less a PR thing. For the Afghans, it's about practical stuff that they need to actually get some commitments on from the Americans.
Interestingly enough, the US-Taliban peace talks and the announcement of the withdrawal, of course, was the doing of the previous US government that was installed and initiated by former US President Trump, who wanted to end all the never-ending wars. President Biden, interestingly enough, did not tinker with that. He continues along the same line. You are in the US quite a bit. You have many contacts there. What are people telling you there when the issue is Afghanistan?
Well, I think President Biden, I mean, to be fair to him, he's always been very frank when it comes to Afghanistan. I think that if you read Bob Woodward's book or you read Obama's biography, you see that Biden opposed the surge in 2009. He's always been very suspicious of what the military tells the White House. And he made it very clear months before the elections that, the Americans need to get out of Afghanistan. I think the interview was with CNN, and that, and his messages were also echoed by others in the administration. I think that if he had the option, he probably would have, they would have probably gone with a more responsible drawdown of troops. But I think that their backs were against the wall. It was either get out ASAP, or then just basically, throw away the Taliban deal, and then have the Taliban attack U.S. troops once again, which, I think for any U.S. president, the loss of U.S. soldiers is probably not something that they would want to go with. So I think he must have had a very, there were two difficult options for the U.S. president, and he went with what he felt was the right decision. And in his own ways, I mean, it's a courageous decision, because I think it could have, the consequences could be dire. A humanitarian disaster, a massive refugee issue, for not just for the region, but also for the Europeans, drugs, terrorism, and so forth and so forth.
Yeah, the ramifications and collateral damages of that decision are yet to be seen, of course, but they can be quite dangerous to the United States. From a boomerang perspective, looking at the time, we have 15 minutes left. So again, this is a reminder to the audience, if you want to submit questions, and now is a good time. Saad Mohseni, you travel a lot. You're in the UK, you're in Europe, you are in the US. What is the biggest misconception the rest of the world have of Afghanistan?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is I had breakfast with someone a few weeks back in Washington, and you know, he was discussing how Afghanistan has been a failure for the US. And I said, what if Afghanistan has been a success? You know, the most backward country has been transformed into sort of a, you know, relatively speaking, an open society. It's, you know, we have just on when it comes to media and freedom of expression, we are freer than, you know, if you go from sort of even from East Asia all the way to North Africa and Eastern Europe, Afghanistan is freer than most of these countries. We have a, you know, we comparing ourselves to, you know, some of the giants like India and Turkey. I mean, there's no competition. I mean, you can say and you can express yourself, and there'll be no ramifications. And from a legal, well, at least the government's not going to come after you. Or if they do, you can manage it. And we've managed it well enough over the last 20 years. So I think it's something to be very proud of. And today, when you see young people engaged, men and women in civil society, you see lots of women in the workforce, or at least going to universities and colleges and high schools, as well as primary schools right across the country. These are huge successes. And you know, people talk about the golden age in the 1970s. That's a bit of a myth. But I think the transformation we've seen over the last 2 decades is very real. And I think this is the story that most people outside of Afghanistan are not aware of.
We have one more question coming in. Speaking of the misconceptions, of course, that the rest of the world might have of Afghanistan. The question is, all Central Asians want peace and prosperity for Afghanistan. At the same time, leaders of Central Asian countries express firm stand on belief that only Afghans themselves could resolve the conflict without interfering in the country's internal affairs. Regardless, Central Asian countries express readiness to assist Afghanistan. What kind of level of support do you expect or foresee from neighboring countries or from the Central Asian region in these challenging times, is the question.
Well, because of our links, you know, obviously our Central Asian friends have been, you know, fairly supportive, but some of the other neighbors have been very much involved in intra-Afghan politics, and from funding organizations to offering sanctuaries to different groups, whether they're political or military or militias or armed groups. So the neighbors can play a very important role. I think that's why trade is so important, is to the regional connectivity and regional economic integration can play such an important role. There has to be regional consensus, ultimately, if we're to see peace in Afghanistan. And I think that the Central Asians can play an important role, not just in terms of what they can do, but also in terms of influencing others, whether it's Russia or Iran, or even the South Asians. I think that collectively, I think this is, unfortunately, it's not just an Afghan problem. It's a global problem, but it's more, you know, more important than it's actually a regional problem.
The stability of Afghanistan is very much desired and wanted on the part of countries in the region, says our questionnaire. Of course, the idea that Afghanistan can and should remain a progressive modern republic, as you say, is quite uncertain given the developments that we might face. When you talk to people on the ground in Afghanistan, not entrepreneurs, but the real people on the ground, what are they telling you? What are their greatest concerns? What are their greatest fears?
I think security. I think for most people, you know, they have their kids going to school, they have their wives perhaps working, they have members of their extended families. You know, no one wants to, you know, not know what's going to happen to them the next day. So I think physical security is very important. Then, of course, there's economic security and worries or stresses over, who's going to, how they're going to actually pay for the next meal. And of course, the bigger picture in terms of what's going to happen to the country, the gains, these values that we've all, we've been so supportive of. So a combination of many things. I mean, you're talking about a relatively large population of 35 odd million people. Afghans are tough, but I would say that this, is probably will test the toughest of them all. What we're going through today.
Yeah, for certain. A severe test, a very grave test awaits the population of Afghanistan, the resilience and the progress of the Afghan nation in the next few weeks, months, if not years to come. You mentioned trade. Farrukh Sultanov has submitted a question playing along those lines. He's saying there's not much progress, at least less than it was expected, and intensity in trade between Afghanistan and Central Asia. What, in your opinion, are the key reasons, from your point of view, for this lack of trade, or at least for not meeting the expectations?
I haven't looked at the numbers, but I do recall someone telling me recently that actually trade has gone up significantly, now often pretty low base. But I think the cost of transportation is still pretty high because of this, the security situation in Afghanistan. So trucking goods back and forth can be fairly expensive. I think in terms of policy and sort of ensuring that that products are not taxed and so forth, that's been dealt with. So technically speaking, we probably have a much better environment. But I think, this is one of the reasons why they want to build this railway link between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, because it'll reduce costs significantly, and you can get products from South to Central Asia fairly quickly, within hours, rather than sort of days. And also, I think what we're seeing now is, the creation of these sort of tax-free zones in different parts of the region. I know the Uzbeks are looking to build this sort of 3,000 hectare free zone in the Surkhandarya area, and then there are also plans for something similar in eastern Afghanistan. All of this will help trade between the two regions. But I think we have to do a lot more. And I know there's a major conference in Tashkent in mid-July hosted by President Mirziyoyev. I think that
Saad's connection just froze, unless it's just me, but it doesn't appear that way. Let me just double check. Yeah, it seems to be, if I can get a sign from our organizers. Yeah, Saad is frozen, unfortunately. It's not me, it's Saad, so that's very unfortunate, of course. Let's see if you can go back on track. We had only 5 minutes left anyway, though a couple more questions to come. Talan Sultanov asked a very pertinent one about the future of the company and which regions he's thinking about investing in next. And also Farrukh Sultanov, there was a two-part question about whether he sees the Afghan press culture and media as a uniting factor in the region. Now, we only would have had 5 more minutes anyway, so I'm going to give it a few more seconds. Hopefully Saad can rejoin us. If let's see, he seems to be reconnecting. Saad, can you hear us? I think he's just connecting. At least we see him, which is a good sign.
Yes.
Saad, wonderful, wonderful.
So I don't know what happened.
No worries, these things happen. Look, 15 months into COVID and online and Zoom conferences, I think everybody is full in understanding and a sympathy for things like these to happen. Important thing, you're back for the last 5 minutes. It's good to have you back. So why don't you pick up where you left off?
No, I'm just going to say that there's, we need to do more in terms of, whether it's infrastructure or, policies that would help facilitate trade between the regions, encouraging the business sector of these different countries invest, and why can't we get more companies to invest in Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, and why can't we get Afghan entrepreneurs who've made so much money over the last 2 decades invest in Central Asia and Pakistan? So I think that we need to do more in these sorts of conferences, like the one being hosted by President Mirzayev, going to be so helpful.
And this e-CAMCA forum, of course, is also a wonderful venue to voice these concerns and proposals and suggestions. We have 5 minutes left. I do want to bring in the last 2 questions out from the audience. Actually, Farouk's question was a 2-part question. He said, do you see the Afghan press, culture, and media as a uniting factor in the region, a uniting factor of Kyrgyz, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Turkmens on both sides of the Afghanistan border?
It's a uniting factor, you were saying?
Yeah, whether it is a uniting factor, whether you see the Afghan press, culture, and media as a uniting factor in the region.
Well, I think that Afghans are a good role model for the rest of the region. Not all governments will probably agree with free press. It shows that if the Afghans can adopt it and can live with it, and the politicians in Afghanistan have developed thick skins over the years. They have to get up and answer people's questions and deal with exposés. I'm sure the Tajiks can also live with it, and same for the Kazakhs and others. So it's a good example of, and there's much we can learn from our friends in Central Asia. I mean, in terms of building infrastructure and reforms and so forth. I think there are lessons for everyone on both sides.
Let me bring in the last question from the audience. Talan Sultanov is asking, it's also a good way to wind down this conversation looking forward. The company that you started works in several countries across continents. How do you decide which countries to enter, and what new markets are you considering right now? We touched upon this.
Well, I mean, actually, yeah, we've actually have slowly exited many of our international businesses of late. It's been a conscious effort to exit the media sector, but we're looking at other opportunities. I think we look at sectors, we look at people, we look at the underlying economy. There are a whole range of things. So, how developed is the sector? What's the competitive environment? Can we have an impact? Do we have the right people to run the business? What are the risks in terms of the economy or the politics? Will they tolerate a foreign company to operate? And we went to Burma, for example, and we had a really good opportunity, but then we were told that as Muslims we were not welcomed. This was a number of years ago, and it's a good thing we didn't get in there, for example. So, everything else is perfect. The economy looked great, the opportunity looked great. It's a wonderful country, but that minor thing that we would not be welcomed was enough for us to pull the plug on the opportunity.
We're almost about done. Final stretches, last 60 seconds, which is good because the connection still seems somewhat shaky in the UK. So your country has seen decades of bloodshed. You talked frankly about the trauma that you personally encountered when moving from Australia to Afghanistan. Are you optimistic about the future of the country, despite, of course, the many difficulties and uncertainties that lay ahead? So what does your gut feeling tell you? Are you optimistic about the future of Afghanistan?
Yes, perhaps not in the very immediate future, but I think if we had to talk about 2023 or 2024, I think I'm optimistic. But I think there are some challenges ahead, to put it mildly.
Some challenges.
So I think we have to be we have to be prepared for some downs and some more downs before we go up. And I hope I'm wrong.
Without some challenges ahead, and hopefully the best case scenario, may the positive, optimistic scenario for Afghanistan play out. I think I speak for all who have joined this talk in saying this has been extremely informative, very insightful to hear from the chairman and CEO of the Mobi Group, Saad Mohseni. Thank you so much for your time, for your insights, for your expertise and your opinions, of course, in a country and concerning a country that is going to dominate the headlines moving forward. And we wish you personally, but the country, of course, all the best. Thank you so much, Saad Mohseni. Thank you for everyone who joined us. Thank you for the questions that have been submitted, and stay tuned for the rest of the e-CAMCA Forum.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks to our friends at the Rumsfeld Foundation.